I want to say welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this afternoon's performance. Our story will play out at President Madison's Montpelier estate, a plantation some 5,000 acres in size in his home state of Virginia. The year is 1817. President Madison is in his first year of retirement, and James Monroe is now President of the United States. We are all being received today in the formal drawing room as invited guests to give Mr. Madison some much-needed company. He copiously thanks you for making the long, arduous journey and invites you to stay as long as you'd like. Mr. Madison recalls making some of your acquaintance back in 1791 when he and Mr. Jefferson took a much-needed break from the political turmoil in Philadelphia to relieve their recurring physical maladies and toured New York and the New England states simply for health, recreation, and curiosity. Mrs. Hill has visited Montpelier before and assures you the trip will be worth the effort. Mr. Madison is 66 years old now and has been in public service since he was 25. Okay, so we find Mr. Madison inside his drawing room after completing his routine morning ride around the plantation. Thank you, Mr. Madison, for receiving our rather large party today.
Indeed. Welcome, everyone, to my estate, Montpelier, in Orange County, Vermont. I must say that you have arrived just in time, and I have come inside just in time because right outside we have a storm going on, such the size that I remember when the Washington City was being stormed by the British troops back in 1814 during the Great War of 1812. But it seems to have subsided, and I'm glad that your horses were able to bring your carriages up the driveway quick enough for you to come into the drawing room. I must regret that Mrs. Madison will not be able to join us today. She has been called to take care of a dear friend of ours, and she promises she will return. Although I didn't get wet, I can tell you that I am wet from the inside out. I'm sure about this time of year, even New Englanders are feeling the heat and humidity.
How are you feeling, Mr. President, now that the stress of your political career is over?
Oh, my dear Mrs. Gill, I couldn't be more relieved. And welcome, and thanks for coming back and bringing some of your fine friends from New England states. Can everyone hear me all right? Well, I'll tell you, sometimes my voice doesn't carry very far, and I just want to be able to make sure that everybody can hear me. Excuse me for taking a drink, and I will be offering all of you some libations as soon as possible. But I just got off my morning ride and to survey the crops, and I can tell you, rain is a welcome addition for us, because last year we had such a drought of such proportions that it destroyed my crops about 2 to 1. So we only had about 1/3 of the harvest that we were expected, and that was throughout our entire growing season through all the plantation states, all the way through South Carolina and Georgia. So of course, as planters, we all are victims of the weather, just like everyone else. But I can tell you exactly how I felt when I left the president's mansion to leave it in the good hands of our now 5th president, President James Monroe. People he as giddy as a child, which I must admit I was, jumping up and down like a little leprechaun. I was so happy and relieved. We took a steamboat ride up the Anacostia River for about 14 miles until we docked at the ferry, and then boarded a carriage as we had transported most of our furnishings already back to our state here at Montpelier, and I just felt so relieved and happy that I could go home.
I understand, Mr. President, that you graduated university at the College of New Jersey in Princeton. How is it that a native Virginian journeyed all the way to New Jersey and did not attend the College of William and Mary on the coast of Williamsburg?
Oh, my dear, that is a bit of a story. and welcome my guests. Please make sure you make yourselves comfortable. Mrs. Madison will return at some point, and I hope some of you make a stay of it here. Don't hurry back. It took you so long and so much effort. I know how the roads are. And if we have much more of this rain, all you're going to do is get stuck in the mud. We may have you trapped here for a while, which I hope is indeed the case, because although we do receive guests here on a regular basis, we have not received such a large party as yours in quite a while. And more than myself, Mrs. Madison is going to revel in your presence, I guarantee it. When we were in Washington City, she did something for our country in an unofficial capacity, but in a very official, effective way, which was to bring unity of thinking to our country. At the time, Mr. Jefferson, who preceded me, you know, was a bachelor, a widower, in fact, and he never did remarry, so he had to occupy the president's mansion for a long period of time with no one else but his personal secretary, which happened to be, by the way, Meriwether Lewis of the Lewis and Clark expedition, as you recall, that explored all the way to the Pacific coast to find out exactly how large our North American continent was. And his comment was that we were louder than two little church mice. So Mrs. Madison, getting some entertaining experience when we lived together in Philadelphia, and then served as state to Mr. Jefferson, the president, in the White House before we were able to move into an apartment ourselves. She is most anxious to greet you all. To get back to Mrs. Gill's question, well, that harkens back many years now, since I'm 66. And when I was but a boy, after getting tutored 30 miles away, in fact, when I was but 11 or 12 years old, to Mr. Donald Robertson to get the basics in the classic education, there was some talk about a new president that was going to take over the College of New Jersey in Princeton. And my father, his ears perked up, because after I was tutored away from home, I came home, and the Reverend Thomas Martin was a graduate of the College of New Jersey in Princeton, and he told us of the open-minded attitude that that college had ever since the Reverend John Witherspoon had come to become the president. And we all thought about it, Mr. Martin highly recommending the College of New Jersey, but also knowing that any family of our luck that had the means financially to send their number one son to a college and a university all went to the College of William and Mary, including Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Wythe, who tutored him in the law prior to that. So it was a little unusual for a Virginian to go anywhere besides the College of William in New Jersey. But there was two main factors, Mrs. Gill and our guest, that I would like to address to you. One was my health. You have to understand that I was never strong with a physical constitution here. My muscles were all housed in this little muscle up here called my brain. And I have been sickly really throughout my life, which I hate to admit, but it is true. And my father thought that if I went to the coastal areas where we had epidemics periodically come through of various means, whether it was malaria, dysentery, typhoid, yellow fever, or whatever the case may be, that he thought that my physical constitution might not be able to withstand such an epidemic and a disease of that virulence, you see. So for one, he was concerned about my health, and he knew that the New Jersey air was going to be much fresher. Second was the reputation, you see, that the College of William and Mary had attained. It's an Anglican university, and you know that the Anglicans it's the official church of England. And part of what we did in order to separate ourselves and become the United States of America was to break away from the mother country, Great Britain. So after that, and the establishment of our Bill of Rights in 1791, we have freedom of religion. And many of the Anglican principles still take strong hold with some of the people who want to retain those. But the overarching opinion of Americans now is that we should be able to be free, not only to tolerate religion, but to exercise it with complete and absolute freedom. not being Anglican, raised Anglican, I was raised Episcopalian, and my father was a vestryman, which means that he attended church regularly, but I tended not to. But that doesn't mean I don't believe in God. And the Reverend John Witherspoon up at the College of New Jersey in Princeton came from Scotland. And he came to a theological seminary, which essentially the College of New Jersey was, to train those to become ministers. There are really only largely two professions that a professional person might decide that they want to do. They might want to go into the ministry, or they might want to go into the law, or they might want to go into medicine. But there was a certain serendipitous factor, I think, that I didn't know at the time about going all the way up to New Jersey to that fresher air. The principles and the liberal, in the most general of aspects, education that I got, I believe gave me some of the philosophical principles upon which I was to make my future decisions, having to do with the political theory that we would develop our country under, which is to say, a representative republic. So for those two reasons, a lack of health and a new kind of thinking that was much more broad-based, the Anglican Church of William and Mary had debauched itself, quite frankly, and some of the professors were observed drinking and doing things that are not proper character traits of proper professors. And the college had not reeled that in yet and gotten control of that situation. So it was a perfect situation for me to attend, and I enjoyed my time up there immensely. Now, I did want to bring in some of my guests here while we're waiting for Mrs. Madison. If you'll excuse me, I'll take please don't tell Mrs. Madison that I wore my boots inside. She doesn't want her carpets ruined, which I can understand, because when we were in the federal city, we opened our doors to everyone once a week on Wednesday evenings. We had 400 people in our Oval Room, and they came in with their duty boots and everything. Some of them came from the Western Territories, and they were far away from home, and they seemed sequestered out into the various parts of the federal city that was still being developed. And Mrs. Madison thought, in order for us to coalesce a Republican point of view, we should mix our social engagements. Otherwise, we have pockets of people that are only talking to other people that have the same frame of mind. And in order for a Republican system of government to work, we really need to have a good mixture of opinions. So her household, the president's mansion, became the social center for the Washington scene. And we entertained guests, in the hundreds on a weekly Wednesday evening basis. And no one was turned away, dirty boots and all. But what I like to enjoy with my guests is conversation. I do actually like to listen to people. In fact, when we're sitting at the dinner table, it is not I that sits at the front of the table. At the head of the table is Mrs. Madison. I prefer to sit in the middle along the long side of the table so that I can hear everyone on either side of me and take in what everyone's perspectives are, and therefore I can comment on, not necessarily lecture to, what I believe my opinions are. I simply mix mine in with everybody else's, and Mrs. Madison is at the head of the table so she can direct our domestics to supply everything with all the proper food and drink at the proper time. So if any of you have perhaps brought some questions with you and have shared them with Mrs. Gill, I invite you to open up the floor for conversations of any kind, public or private.
President Madison, I had heard that you're sort of reserved as a president. Would you say that's true?
Reserved as a president? Yes. I was reserved as a president. And part of that is my natural character. When I am doing my public business, I'm very serious, I'm very straightforward, and I'm very, let's get down to the bones of what's going on. And I also felt that the president's position was not to be overbearing. We witnessed, after we developed the Constitution, General Washington became President Washington. And President Washington then became President Adams. And once about 1791 happened, our country split into two opposing points of view. And none of us wanted it, none of us liked it, none of us preferred it. But what we were arguing against, and Mr. and I were of the same mind in this regard, was that the president and the office of the president was getting too much power. In order for the executive branch to balance properly, according to the Constitution, with the legislative and the judicial, he needs to take his place. It is not any way dictatorial or overt. So my place was to administer what was going on in my department. So being reserved, I thought, was an advantage in order to demonstrate what it was that the position of the president was to do. I will say there was an exception, however. As I was Secretary of State coming up into Mr. Jefferson's two-term presidency from the turn of the century in 1800, you might remember the virulent nature of that revolution, as he called it, an election revolution, was the time when the Democratic Republicans, as we had sort of self-named ourselves, had replaced the Federalists, which were George Washington and John Adams. And Mr. Jefferson had me as his Secretary of State. And we imposed so many embargoes and tried to get peaceful solutions to turbulent times upcoming during that century, when the British were not respecting the treaty terms of not only the one that ended our war for independence in 1783, the Treaty of Paris, but also Mr. Jay's Treaty of 1795, which said they would evacuate our country, which said that they would not impress sailors, that we could open up trade. And then we had to, when they didn't do those things, we decided to take economic sanctions. And the embargoes ended up backfiring on us. Not only did they hurt the world economy, they hurt our own domestic. And it was your states up in the northern states that were very much opposed to these embargoes, because you were looking forward to opening trade. You had all your fisheries, and you had your ports in Boston and the New York Harbor, and they were all set up for mercantile business. Because down here, you can see that it probably took you forever to get to the home, and you were wondering where all our neighbors were. They're so far apart with our plantations being of acres large. We don't have the industrialization that Mr. Hamilton, for example, envisioned, which your part of the country embraced. So there came a time in 1812, during my first administration, and I was elected in 1809, and I realized that the embargoes were no longer going to be effective. They never were, and they weren't going to be. And we were going to have to take a stronger stand. And my reserve fell to the wayside. I stood on principle, and it was purely a point of honor that I requested from Congress a declaration of war on, I can't remember the exact date, but it was in this month of June. And by June the 17th or 18th or so, only about a week later, they agreed and granted us that we would declare war against Great Britain. And that would be the second of our battles and our wars with that former mother country. So I would say that when the time came and I was pushed, I was going to take action and not remain reserved. Yes, Mrs. Gill.
Questions are starting to roll in.
All right.
As a young boy, what was your classical education like?
Very good. I'm sorry I didn't get into those details. Donald Robertson was the best known tutor in all of Virginia, and he was 30 miles away from us. And he was the one that taught me the literal classics. So those would be our languages, I learned Latin as an 11-year-old boy. I learned Greek as the two main classical languages. I began to learn some French, although I never was able to speak French. I could read it quite fluently by the time I reached adulthood. Geography, mathematics, astronomy, different physics, the sciences, literature, some music, everything that a classical education is supposed to prep a young charge for later university admittance. And I got that thoroughly from Mr. Robertson. In fact, I said later in life, more than Dr. Witherspoon, in fact, at the College of New Jersey and Princeton, that if it was not for Mr. Robertson, I would not be in the position I am today. So that's the kind of classical education I received as a young boy. Thank you for that question.
And kind of related, can you tell us more about your childhood? Maybe that shaped you into a president?
I was a little reluctant. I never envisioned myself as a president of the United States, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was the oldest of the children. And I have 3 brothers and 3 sisters. They're not all with us now, but my mother had 12 children total, of which 7 of us lived to adulthood. So I was the firstborn, and the firstborn happened to be a son myself. So I'm James Madison Jr., technically. And so I knew I was going to inherit my father's plantation. We didn't start out at Montpelier, however. We started out at my grandfather's place called Mount Pleasant, about 0.6 of a mile on the road. And when I was about 11 years old, we made a move from Mount Pleasant to Montpelier, because about 1764, I was probably 13 years old. And said, yeah, I was 13 years old, 1764, because I was born in 1751. I remember taking furniture from one place to another. And growing up, I was expected to be the number 1 son. However, I was plagued with different kinds of, mostly stomach trouble, which is why I've remained thin most of my life. You see that I'm not completely thin now. That's due to Mrs. Madison and my place in society, I must say, which I was lucky to get to. But it is a double-edged sword, however. So I remained sickly, but was expected to teach my younger brothers and sisters. My sisters got their education from my mother, who is still with us, by the way, in her 90s, living in a separate wing in the home here in Montpelier. And you can visit her if you like. She usually takes visitors about 2 p.m., and she would love to speak to you. And when I went off to college at New Jersey, I reluctantly came home not knowing what I was going to do, because I stayed for an extra 6 months to try and figure it out, because I knew I wasn't going to be a minister. Remember, I asked you before if you could hear me? I'm trying to speak up because this is not my normal talking voice. My normal talking voice is so low that people would constantly say to me, Mr. Madison, can you please speak up? We can't hear you past the first row. So I knew I couldn't physically go into the ministry. And because I do fervently believe in freedom, in fact, I will go to my grave with 2 main points: religious freedom and the rights of the minorities. I will always stand for. But I knew my heart and soul wasn't in the ministry. So I thought, well, then maybe I should choose the law. And I studied some law, and I stayed for an extra 6 months, learning directly under Dr. Witherspoon, theology specifically, to see if I could learn more about the religions, and studied Hebrew as about the 6th language that I added to my repertoire. And after I got out, I realized that the law wasn't going to be for me either. And my visions had to do more with what was going on in the world and how our country was going to find its place on the world stage. But then I had to go home and tutor my brothers and sisters. That I wasn't too excited about. I tried not to let it show, but I wanted to get moving on with my life. And it wasn't until 1776, well, 75 actually, when Governor Patrick was the governor, that I decided to get into the Patriot River because of the Boston Port Bill. And once the Boston Port Bill came and they closed the port of Boston, they had the Boston Tea Party, I was fully a fervent patriot. And I became a member of the Orange County Committee of Safety, the Orange County Committee of Correspondence, and the Orange County Militia under my father, who was the commander. I'm sorry if I was a little long-winded there.
Not at all. There seems to be a lot of interest in Mrs. Madison. And how did you meet? Was there a favorite story with her? How long did you court before marrying her?
Mrs. Madison, of course, would be the better of the two of us to tell the story. But I will say that it is peppered with fun and a little intrigue and a little drama. Mrs. Madison, you see, is a widow, and I am her second husband. She married young, around 21 years old in 1790 in Philadelphia. Now, she was a Quaker, and Philadelphia was known as the epicenter of all the Quakers. And she was born in Guilford County, North Carolina, near Greensboro. But then she was around 10 years old, the family moved into Southern Virginia, where Hanover is now. So she spent into her early to mid-teens in Hanover, Virginia. I think has said before already that she has always identified as a Virginian. But her father, being an ardent Quaker, wanted to manumit the slaves, moved to Philadelphia, and start a new business in order to be in that area. And so they did. They upped and moved to Philadelphia, and he started a brand new business, which was laundry starch. And her brothers and sisters, she has 3 brothers and 3 sisters as well, in fact, and she's the oldest. So we do have that in common. But she is 17 years my junior. So to my 66, she's 49 right now. And so that was always the case, even back then. And what happened was the Quakers, they are a society. They don't say that they're a religion, although they believe in God, but they don't have a minister. And one of their tenets, there are a couple of very main tenets about what the Quakers believe in, which is that they don't believe in war, they're pacifists, and they don't believe in slavery. And another thing is that they believe that you should marry within the faith. So her father, after losing his business, was kicked out. He was read out of meeting, which was extremely shameful for him, and he was bedridden afterwards and emotionally devastated. And I remember Mrs. Madison being feeling so badly about that. And when it came to the time that he was taking his last few breaths, he wanted to make sure that Dolly married well. And there was a young up-and-coming Quaker lawyer named Mr. Todd, who she promised her father that she would marry and have a children and grow up in the faith. And that gave her a lot of pleasure and satisfaction, and I'm sure even more so her father. So Mr. Todd and she started a family, which consisted of 2 boys. And then 1793 came. In 1793, I was a congressman in George Washington's administration, and we had a yellow fever epidemic come through. And it just so happened the congressional session was in recess at the time. So we were not in town, but whoever was evacuated the city, and it was chaos. And Mr. Todd, having gotten the family out, Mrs. Todd, the widow, soon to become the widow Todd, unfortunately, my future wife, was not taken ill, but she had just given birth to William, young William the infant, and she was taken out on a litter all the way out to Gray's Ferry. And if you know Philadelphia at all, it's bounded by 2 rivers, the big Delaware on the right, which separates it from New Jersey, and the smaller Schuylkill on the west, which takes you into Valley Forge, where General Washington had his troops encamped during that famous winter, during our Revolution. And Gray's Ferry is just beyond the Schuylkill on the south side of Philadelphia. So she was safe there. Mr. Todd went back into Philadelphia in order to take care of his parents who had contracted the disease. Well, unfortunately, everyone got sick, including Mrs. Madison, who survived a mild form of the yellow fever, but nobody came out alive except Mrs. Todd and the older of the 2 boys. So she was now the widow Todd at 26 years old, and I used some strategy, you see. I do have some reasoning powers, and I decided to get a recommendation from President and Mrs. Washington. Now, Mrs. Todd, when she was Mrs. Todd, had already been within the social scene with Mr. Todd and had known Mrs. Washington personally. And so I sought a recommendation from the couple, and they gladly said that they would concur with that, because I really didn't think that Mrs. Todd would give me the time of day. I'm short, I'm sickly, I'm not particularly handsome, I'm not particularly overt, as one gentleman or lady had said that asked about my reserve, which I have come out of. But yes, in my younger days, I was strictly a wallflower and wanted to talk business and talk academics and all the boring things. And the widow Todd was known to be efficacious and ebullient and friendly and smart and beautiful and just wanted to make friends with everyone. And I was smitten. And there was only one reason that I was going to marry, which isn't always the case in our time, and that's for love. And so I had to give it a shot, and I said, I probably have one. And so I got to know her, and you'll never guess who introduced us. Does anybody know that Senator Aaron Burr introduced me to my future wife? Senator Aaron Burr, a very influential senator in our Congress at the time from New York, introduced us. He was part of the social scene, and he was very devoted to his wife and his daughter. And the widow Todd, Dolly, thought that he would be a very good person to inquire into about who might be a good match for her. And when I asked for an introduction from Mr. Burr, he said yes. And when I knocked on that door, I was nervous. But when she let me in, we started courting almost immediately. We went out horseback riding and talked about all the things that she was interested in, fashion and flowers, and also things that were going on in the world. Took little John Payne along with us, and it got to be June, and I decided to propose. Well, she was faced with a conundrum, in fact. I'm not a Quaker and never intended to switch to Quaker. So she knew that if she said yes to my proposal, that she would be kicked out and read out of the meeting. So she put me off. Said, all right, I'll consider it, but I'm going off to Hanover, where I grew up, to visit some relatives, which I'd already planned on. I'll give it some serious consideration. And finally, I heard back from her in August after biting my fingernails for a full 2 months, and she said yes. So not only were we married in September the 15th, which is a very special day for me, because that is my parents' anniversary. And we were not only married in the same place, but on the same day as my parents.
2 more questions. One, can you describe your relationship with Patrick Henry? Was it a friendship or not? And also, what was the hardest part about being president?
Is that from the same person?
No.
2 different people. All right. So, Mr. Patrick Henry. Well, I've already brought his name up once. Mr. Henry's no longer with us. And when I was a youth, he was our governor. And in 1775, I ended up becoming a member of his Council of State. As a very young boy, my first foray into politics was to be in the General Assembly of the state level, Virginia politics. And he was the governor. And he was a great speaker, a wonderful orator, a great patriot, famously known for saying, give me liberty or give me death, in St. John's Church in Richmond as we were contemplating revolution. And at first I thought he was a very astute and proper governor. But as time went on, our paths diverted quite virulently to the point where he took, well, I'll say it as point of fact. It is a fact that Mr. Henry tried to stop me from getting into government at all. So we did part with animosity. There was animosity between us. And I could get into the details, but I see that that's probably not where we're going in that. But I remember debating his candidate, Mr. Monroe. Oh, what a tale we weave. Mr. Monroe is a good friend of mine, and I had to debate him for a seat in the House because Mr. Henry wanted to block my entrance into the United States Congress. And so he changed the voting districts, which one of your Massachusetts men is known to have done, Mr. Elbridge Gerry. But he did that many years before. Mr. Henry did it to try and block me out of the Congress. So no, we did not end with a good relationship. And then how hard was it to be president was the next one. How hard was it to be president?
I'm sorry, what was the hardest thing about it?
Oh, the hardest thing about it. All right, the hardest thing about it. Keeping us together under the Constitution, for one. Now think about it. We had written the Constitution in 1787. We went through the process of ratification in 1788. We got a president in 1789. He served 2 terms, and by the time it became 1809, if we do the arithmetic, that's 13 and 9, we had a constitution of about 22 years. So as we had a change in political theory with the election of Mr. Jefferson, I was going to take the country in the same, what we would call in the general sense, small r Republican direction. But our focus was still overseas. We were still coming out of the trade embargoes that were not working well. I instituted another trade embargo in 1809, and the impressment of our sailors was going on relentlessly to the point of overtness that was becoming a blatant disregard for the treaties. And I saw external turmoil with the Barbary pirates, which started with Mr. Jefferson's first term in 1801. And the Barbary pirates, if you're not familiar, are up in the northern part of Africa. And they had commanded the seas and pirated the seas so much that they had demanded that anyone pay tribute so that they would not interfere with the trade. And we were sucked into that so that we were paying tribute to the Barbary pirates. Well, I didn't like that at all either. And I realized that in order for us to maintain a world stage presence, thinking that Great Britain was really never going to let us go, I think they had in the back of their minds that they could retake us by staying here under cover, so to speak, out in the Western territories, and finding a weakness and also trying to develop more of a loyalist attitude, that the stress involved trying to get an American viewpoint, to get us to coalesce of thinking that we were Americans and not Virginians, Americans and not Massachusetts, Americans, not Connecticut people. And so the stress was revolved around the groundswell, and the back of my mind knowing that there was going to be a world eruption, and I had to do something to intercede, and it ended up being a declaration of war. That was the stressful part of the presidency there.
Thank you. Can you elaborate on your interest in the rights of minorities at that time?
Can I elaborate on the yes, of course I can do that. I did a lot of political theory study that led up to the conventions that gave us the Constitution, which is our governmental system. And what I saw over and over and over again, even with democracies, was that there was going to be an overbearing influence from the majority. And the majority was always going to step over the minority and become a corrupt power monger of some sort. And it was played out in history over and over and over again. And probably the seed that was planted had to do with both of the concepts of religious freedom and the minorities. You see, when I was a young boy, there was a group of Baptists in my part of the Piedmont in Virginia. And I literally saw and watched them be subdued by the Anglicans, which was the official Church of England when we were colonies of England. And they were put behind bars. And they were not given the proper rights to simply stand there and espouse what their religious beliefs were. And so they became an oppressed minority. And I just found that conscientiously, I couldn't live with that. So I grew up in a family, and I grew up in a period of time where men that led other men and were going to be given that additional responsibility needed to have the character traits, to have the country that they were, or the constituency that they were serving, the best in mind overall. We cannot simply play to a demagoguery or a majority that becomes overbearing just because they're larger. We must be able to have some kind of moderator of character, some virtue in the people. And that is what I found in my heart needed to be espoused in whatever my career move was.
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to try to share a picture of your study, and I'm hoping maybe you could say a little bit about that. Let me see if I can do it. Do you see that?
Oh, a familiar window, indeed. Spent many, many, many an hour in front of that window. You're all invited to come up and see my study. When Mrs. Madison comes back, she'd love to give you a tour of the entire estate, in fact. But that is the room where I wrote a lot of my preparation for the convention in the Constitution. And those ridge of mountains you see in the far distance, those are the Blue Ridge Mountains. And we are looking westward. They're about 20 miles away. And they give me such a peaceful sense of a frame of mind that I can get into that I need to study and write a paper of some means, some meat. Could you remind me of the question? I must be going senile.
No, I just wanted to share it and hear a little about it. That was perfect. I think if anyone has kind of a closing question, I'll look for, or if anyone wants to speak, I can look to unmute you. But we're reaching that time. This has been so wonderful. I'm looking for any hands. Or maybe from you, Mr. Madison, if you had something you wanted to share.
Well, of course. I mean, it's still the lunch hour. We don't normally take our dinner until 4 o'clock. And that means that you can all step in and see my Mother Madison. And that'll be around 2 o'clock. And we'll be serving dinner around 4 o'clock. And we'll be having a supper probably around 9 p.m. And the rain has stopped. So usually what we do is we go out onto the portico and have drinks and cigars and do some more mingling. And I invite you to do all that. We also have decks on top on the north and south end of our additions. And we can go up there and have a view of the Blue Ridge Mountains and continue our discourse there. And you can enjoy the grounds. We have a formal garden down in the southern part of the area. And we have a number of different tree species that have been planted here. And I'd be willing to share any information that you have to ask me questions about as you stroll around the grounds.
Well, thank you so much. Again, thank you to Oasis for sponsoring today's program. If anyone wanted to unmute themselves for a last comment to Mr. Madison, I think I might have to do that for you. But if you raise your hand, I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming. This has been really great. And thank you, Madison, for being here.